Hello everyone, this is the presentation over incorporating quotations, including using signal phrases and MLA in-text citations to properly incorporate your quotations. So we only quote sparingly, only when we need to use the author's exact words to convey a particular point. We use the language word for word, and only when it's a quotable quote, and we want to be sure to preserve the original author's phrasing. When we quote, we always put quotation marks around it and we sandwich the quote. And this presentation is going to focus a lot on what that sandwiching means. Now, let's talk about first that citation. So we pull in a quotation. Here we have a quotation from an author called Jonathan Gottschall, rubbery and easy to shape. And the basic thing that goes in an MLA in-text citation is the author's last name, a space, and then the page number. Please notice it's not P period and then the page number. It's not PG. It's not the word page. It's just the author's last name, a space, and the page number it came from, okay? Now, if the signal phrase or the same sentence that the quote appears in already includes the author's last name. So here we say Gottschall says, then we do not repeat the author's last name here in the parenthetical citation. This is called a parenthetical citation because it's in parentheses. We also call it an in-text citation because it's in your writing, not at the very end, right? It's text, it's cited within your own text. So if it already includes it, we only use the page number. So only 219 here in the parenthetical citation. Note as well, the punctuation comes after the parenthetical has ended because this is a part of your sentence. The citation is a part of your sentence. You don't want to end the sentence here with a period and then just leave the citation hanging sentenceless. It's a part of your sentence. And so we put the period afterwards, okay? So I want to remind you too that the textbook reading over chapter 14 is very helpful for this because it has citation styles and then it focuses specifically on MLA format here with MLA style and tells you all different types of situations for in-text citations. So it tells you how to do it and it tells you like if the author is already named in the signal phrase, or we can name the author in parentheses. What if there are 2 or 3 or more authors? What if the author is not a specific person, but an organization? What if the author is unknown? What if there is no page number, right? So all of these particular types of examples. Indirect source is another one. If a source has a quote of a quote, right? If they've quoted somebody else within the source, here's what you put in the parenthetical, QTD period. If it's an article without page numbers as well. So all of those examples are here in the textbook. So this is a textbook chapter that should serve as a resource for you if you come across any of these different types of circumstances. So now on to incorporating quotations. The main rule for incorporating quotations is that they should be actually incorporated. We want to avoid what we call a dropped quotation. Here's an example of a dropped quotation. See, as you can see, the sentence ends here, and then we begin a sentence with quotation marks. And we always want to avoid beginning a sentence with quotation marks in a formal essay type of writing. So we call this a dropped quotation because instead of incorporating it into the writer's own sentence, it's just dropped in there. Instead of dropping quotations in, we want to make sure to weave the quote into our own writing. So there are 4 different ways that we can weave quotations or incorporate quotations into our own writing. We can use an according to phrase, according to the author, comma, quote. Here's an example of what that would look like. According to Elmo, comma, quote. Red is a pretty color. Or we can use an author, verb, comma, phrase. So Elmo argued, comma, or you could say Elmo said, Elmo explained, Elmo explored, comma, right? Those different attributive verbs like we talked about with summarizing. You could also say author, verb, that. Elmo says that. Red is a pretty color. And notice if we say that, we don't need a comma here because grammatically it sets up the phrase in a different way. Or you can also embed the phrase into your own paraphrase. So you paraphrase what's going on, and then you just pull a particular phrase from the quote instead of using a sentence as a quotation. It would look like this, embedded into your own sentence. Elmo's main thought about red was that it was a pretty color. So you can sort of, if you were to read that without looking at it, you wouldn't know where the quote began because it sounds embedded. But of course, the quotation marks tell it where it began. So we're going to work through what each of these types of weaving will look like and how to set it up. So These three, the first three there, are examples of using a signal phrase. And here, identified in green, is a signal phrase. Each of these is a signal phrase because they signal that a quote is coming. And they also signal to you who said the quote or where the quote came from. These are also sometimes called phrases of attribution or attributive introductions because they attribute the quote to the person who said it before the quote comes in. So here we have according to Gottschall, comma, quote. And then you'll notice that since the author's name is used here, we have only the page number here. Here we have the author verb, comma, Jonathan Gottschall asserts, comma, quote. Or here we have, it's a paraphrase actually. So this one does not use a quotation, but I want to make sure you know that you use a signal phrase before a paraphrase as well. So you still, even though this is in your own words, you still attribute it to the author and you use a signal phrase verb and you still cite it. Okay, so these are signal phrases, but here are some signal verbs, verbs that you can use here. So Jonathan Gottschall argues, Jonathan Gottschall describes, illustrates, suggests, writes, right? You want to choose a verb that makes sense for what's going on in that particular part of the text. When you do that, you want to be really careful not to accidentally use a grammar error to incorporate your quotation. So avoid a run-on or a comma splice. Here's an example of a run-on. Dwight claims mindsets are important. Mindsets lead to different ways of coping with difficulty. This is considered a run-on because it needs punctuation here. It's actually two sentences. It's still really a dropped quotation because it's still a sentence and a sentence. It's just missing the period or the comma that would come here. This is a comma splice example. You cannot just put a comma here because this is actually a complete sentence. We never put two complete sentences together using only a comma. So you want to instead use one of those signal phrases to fix that one without creating a grammatical error in the middle instead. Another thing that you can do is incorporate context into the signal phrase. So sometimes a signal phrase is not going to tell us enough, and sometimes we want our readers to know more about the quote. So here's an example of a signal phrase. Bishnoi acknowledges that the learners are challenged, right? So we have a nice signal phrase leading into the quotation. However, this one also provides extra context, extra information in the same signal phrase. We know it's an article and we have the title of the article. That can be really helpful for giving your readers important information about where the quote is coming from. Finally, option 4 here does not actually use a signal phrase. Instead, it's embedded, and I want to talk about that as well. So this is when you choose a particular phrase from the overall quotation and you weave that phrase into your own paraphrase of the rest of it. So here we go. Elmo's main thought about red was that it was a pretty color. It sounds like your own smooth sentence. Here's another example. We've just taken this one phrase, rubbery and easy to shape. Unlike fiction, reading stories makes us, quote, rubbery and easy to shape. So you see this quote isn't its standalone sentence. And then because we do not have the author as part of the same signal phrase sentence, we put the author space page number it came from. Here's another example. We've just taken the phrase downdraft and incorporated it into a paraphrase. And then because we have Lamott identified right here and then this she that refers back to Lamott, the author is clear. So we can just put the page number here in the parenthetical. But you can see how this is smoothly incorporated into, as just a phrase, into my paraphrase of this section of the reading. She calls the first draft the downdraft because it consists of simply getting words down on a page. This, be really careful in a paraphrase. This is my own words and my own understanding of the text. So provide context and introduce it using a signal phrase. Often you include a summary before the quotation comes in. You cite it using a parenthetical in-text citation, and you're going to use the textbook to help you figure out what goes in there if you have any special cases like 2 authors or no author, right? And then number 3 is to explain and connect the quote. So quotes have to be supported on both sides. You never just put a quote in there and drop it in, and you also never leave it defenseless. Quotes cannot interpret themselves, and your reader is also not responsible for interpreting the sources that you use. Your job as a writer is to interpret the sources for your readers, making sure that they relate to your main claim. So here we have an example. According to Folks' study, we have a little attributive phrase, we have a signal phrase, Dreams may express profound aspects of personality. We have our citation, and then after the citation, you come in and you explain. If so, dreams are essential to human identity. That's an interpretation that you want your readers to get from this quotation. That interpretation is also going to help connect the quote to the point that you are trying to make in the paragraph. Here's another example. We have a quote, according to McKinney's research. Here comes the quotation. This one doesn't have a parenthetical citation. Yours will, but what I want you to notice from this example is the commentary. This shows that yoga can have a positive impact. It's interpreting, explaining the significance of the quotation before you move on. It's your job to link it to the point that you are trying to make. This can also just explain if the quote that you're using is pretty complex. Sometimes you want to come in and explain what the quote means, and then, connect it to the point that you were trying to make. So here's what it will look like to incorporate a quote into your writing. Here we have a summary or some context, right? Before we even get to the quote, we have a whole sentence of summary and context. Then we have a signal phrase, Dweck says that, and a little bit of embedding as well. Then here comes the quote, and we have the citation. In other words comes next. So this is a quote that is a little bit complex. So we have an explanation of what the quote means. And finally, an explanation of the significance of the quote and why it matters. This idea is powerful because ... And then what does Dweck want? Dweck wants us to reflect on this. She wants us to see this. So this is, a couple sentences of explanation of the quote that links it to the point that you, the writer, are trying to make by incorporating the quote in the first place.